If the Frenemies podcast comes back, please don't you guys ever order pizza again. Not on the podcast. You can do that on your own time. Don't do that on our time. Hey there. Before I get into today's topic, I just want to let you know that this video is sponsored by Surfshark VPN. And if you don't mind, I'm going to tell you a little bit about it a little later. But today I want to talk about this whole drama around Trisha Paytas quitting Frenemies, Ethan Klein's response, Trisha's many responses, and honestly, who I think was in the right or in the wrong where and what I think these people should do about the situation. Is it my place to say any of that? Yes, it is. That's what this channel's all about. It's a freaking commentary channel. I don't know why you're here if you're not here to listen to my opinions. This whole situation is, I think a lot of people can agree, sad. It's just sad to watch. And I haven't read a ton of opinions around the internet, or I don't think that I have seen much of it. And the only reason I say that is because I have my opinion, and I'll just go ahead and tell you. I like Ethan and I like Trisha. I like Frenemies. I find it sad that the Frenemies podcast may be done. I find it sad that these two people are beefing more or less. It's sad for many reasons. And I don't side completely with neither Ethan or Trisha. I think both sides have messed up. I think both sides have very valid wants and needs. And I've heard some similar sentiments from friends of mine as well as people within my little pocket of the internet. I'm hearing a lot of the same. Insert time. I just want to note that this video was filmed this past Saturday before any discussion of sexual harassment came out earlier this week. So just keep that in mind. My opinions on that will not be included in this video. Just something to keep in mind. However, when I watch these videos, oh my goodness, the like to dislike ratios on Trisha's videos in particular, it's insane how many dislikes they're getting on their videos compared to Ethan's. I don't remember what the ratio was, but there were more likes than dislikes on his video. Numbers kind of tell you more or less where people's opinions lie. What's all that to say? I just don't know how the hell this is going to be received. That's that. If you're coming here hoping that I'm going to just lay into Ethan or just lay into Trisha, not the video. But if you do want to hear what I think of either side, keep watching. Thanks. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, because I really need to stop assuming that everybody who watches my videos keeps up with what's going on with like YouTube drama, right? Of course, a lot of you do, but a lot of people come to channels like this to know what's going on in the world of YouTube drama. I need to stop assuming that you know what the story is before I tell you about it. So, as I mentioned, this video is sponsored by Surfshark VPN. What is Surfshark VPN? It's a virtual private network that keeps your online identity safe by encrypting all information that travels between your device and the internet. Also, a VPN does swap the real location of your device with another one, more or less giving it like a new IP address. I see that about 50% of my audience is outside of the United States, and how rude is it of me to be talking about all these awesome shows and movies that I'm watching on Netflix or Hulu, Amazon Prime, that you may not be able to access where you are. That's so rude of me. I'm kidding, kind of. I think so. Surfshark has over 3,200 servers in 65 countries. You can access and unlock the content that's not available in your area. We pay a lot of money. Somebody pays. Somebody in your life pays good money for you to watch good TV, right? So why not widen your library? Or if you are traveling abroad, which may happen soon, hopefully, you can make sure to keep the location of your device at home so that when you log onto your device, it feels like you're at home. And listen, you guys have heard me talk a lot lately about cyber bullies, but more importantly, cyber criminals. Safety is really important. And so there is a lot of comfort in knowing that I can have my information private and safe. Masking your IP address is essential to becoming private online. A VPN makes sure that your city, your country, and your download history are not linked to your identity. Surfshark also has a clean web feature feature, which blocks ads, trackers, malware, and phishing attempts. It doesn't monitor, track, or store what you do online. So please click on the link in the description and use code helloleesh to get 83% off plus 3 months free. That's code helloleesh. Link in description. Please, please, please use my code to get 83% off plus 3 months extra for free. And there's absolutely no risk. Surfshark has a 30-day guarantee. So you can literally open a tab right now, click the link, and just give it a go without any risk. You're helping me and you're helping yourself. That's awesome. You can do it while I'm talking to you right now. And as just an added bonus, Surfshark allows you to use one account on unlimited devices, which is crucial for somebody like me because I own unlimited devices. Check them out, especially if you want to show me a little bit of love. All it takes is a click. Thanks, Surfshark, and thank you for giving it a try. So, just to kind of break it down as quickly as possible, earlier this week, Trisha Paytas posted a video to their YouTube channel announcing that they are leaving the Frenemies podcast. Later that day, we saw the most recent episode of Frenemies, and we saw kind of a blow-up that was reminiscent of the blow-ups that we saw in the first 5 episodes or so, but different in ways, and I'll get to that. But there was some sort of like blow-up like we've seen before, and Ethan and Trisha started to get into arguments about really Frenemies as a business and how it is run. And the subsequent videos that would come, the video where Ethan defends himself, the 5 videos, I believe, where Trisha defends themselves, we really started to get a lot of details about the business and probably way more information than we should, definitely way more information than we should be privy to, honestly. And I think everybody agrees on that. In this most recent episode of Frenemies, there was a lot of just weird energy. I don't know if I would say between Trisha and Ethan or just kind of emanating off of Trisha. They did say at the very beginning that they were in a bad mood. We know that they were dealing with something extremely stressful, which was Gabby Hanna telling some BuzzFeed reporter that Trisha was like calling her employers and trying to ruin record deals and like shit like that I don't think anybody believes is really true. So understandably, Trisha went into this episode not in a good place. I get that. Hopefully you get that. And Ethan and Trisha ordered pizza. Why? Why, guys? We know what happens when you order pizza. Something bad always happens when you order pizza. If the Frenemies podcast comes back, please don't you guys ever order pizza again. Not on the podcast. You can do that on your own time. Don't do that on our time because we don't want to see this end again. So they're eating pizza and there are certain segments planned for the podcast. And one of them was going to be, I believe, a Frenemies, like fans write in and ask Ethan and Trisha's advice on certain situations. And Trisha voiced their opinion on the idea for this segment and said that it was dumb and that it made their podcast look lazy, that it's somewhat akin to when a YouTuber doesn't have any ideas and so they just decide to do a Q&A on their channel. Whether or not Trisha should have said that, that's a separate issue that we'll talk about. But Trisha voicing that opinion just started to create, there might have been something cut out because there was a lot of talk, or maybe I just missed something because I've heard a lot of talk about how Trisha was trying to speak on something. They said that they were trying to speak about trans people being killed, if I'm not mistaken. I didn't hear anything like that. And a lot of people have reported that Ethan was talking over Trisha. Maybe I'm going to go back and find that exact moment to see really what happened.
Trans people are getting beat in their face to death.
No, I'm so over that shit.
And so like watching it, I was just like, holy shit. And like Heath Ledger, Jake Gyllenhaal said Heath Ledger refused to make like gay jokes about it like during the Oscars. And I don't know.
Is there a third pizza?
You're so not good about this. Okay, let's go through your stupid.
Make sure that
I don't like
pizza.
this segment. Just for the record, fan advice is a stupid segment.
Why?
But we can do it. It's so dumb. What's the point?
From there, this just kind of escalated into an argument. And that argument ended in Trisha asking Ethan to please shut the episode down. Let's end it. Please end it here. Please, please, please end this and turn off the cameras Don't have me walk off the set like we've done in the past. Essentially, it looked like Trisha was experiencing a lot of what we had seen back in the fall of last year, but trying to handle it differently, in my opinion. So when this situation came to light, my initial opinion was that I totally understood where Trisha was coming from, that they wanted to be more involved in the decision-making process when it comes to anything Frenemies related. And that was totally understandable, in my opinion. But then I saw Ethan's response video and I started to see kind of where he was coming from. And I was like, okay, this is a little more complicated than I initially thought. Frenemies is a podcast that operates under the umbrella of H3 Productions, and H3 Productions has its own operations and their own protocol. They are assuming risk and expenditures and insurances, employees, resources, and really providing the platform where Frenemies lives or lived. And really the part that changed or started to shift my opinion was where Ethan essentially said that Trisha is a flight risk. We've seen them walk off the set a couple of times, citing that they were not coming back. As an audience, we've been through this a couple of times. I think it's, as a side note, just a little more heart-wrenching this time around because we've seen such a stable relationship in this podcast and more success that came along with that. So that's why I think this situation is more emotionally charged than the other ones that preceded it. And after hearing Ethan's side, I did think about how not too long ago, Trisha was saying that, Frenemies feels like a job. It feels like I'm coming to work. It feels like I have coworkers. I feel like you're my boss. Speaking to Ethan, of course, and things like that. And Ethan and Trisha had this conversation on the podcast, really what Trisha's role is within the company. And they clarified Trisha is an independent contractor working for H3 Productions, more or less. And at the time when they had that discussion, it was just like, okay, like define my role. Okay, cool. I like this job is what it sounded like. So from that perspective too, I started to even more so see where Ethan was coming from, being like, this is a big job. This is a big thing to undertake. And there are a lot of moving parts. And it seems that Ethan knows more about that sort of stuff and definitely knows more about what's going on within his own company than Trisha would know. So I started to shy away from siding with Trisha. And then of course, I watched all of those videos. I watched all 5 videos. I may have done it on 2 times speed, but still, I watched them and I took note. I think I already said this, but it seems that just about everyone agrees that these people should have handled all of this offline and that they really shouldn't be talking about money publicly on their platforms. Everybody agrees for the most part, but here we are. It's out there, and what's out there we talk about. So I'm going to do my best here to kind of just boil down the arguments that each party made and then kind of go into my opinions about, who was right and who was wrong where. So clearly the biggest point that Trisha was trying to make was that they thought that they were more or less a 50-50 partner in building and maintaining the Frenemies podcast. And they did make an important point that they've brought a much wider audience to the H3 podcast channel with their presence. And they recognize that on their own, they don't garner the number of views that Frenemies gets. But also Ethan on his own, I don't think the H3 podcast garners as many. I don't know if I can confidently say that because H3 is listed as one of the top 100 podcasts. But the point is that just like they said in a recent episode, together they are greater than the sum of their parts, essentially. So yes, this thing turned out to be so much more successful than I think anyone expected it to be, and it brought a huge audience of people who are there to see Trisha, people who are there to see Ethan, and a lot of people who were there to see the two of them together. So that's important to note, like I said, how much bigger this thing got than it was originally thought to be. I'm pretty sure that nobody expected it to be anything as successful as it is. So the other thing I gathered is that and here I'm just kind of like I said, boiling this down and taking my interpretation from it. So if this is not anybody's exact words, but it seemed to me as though Trisha has been feeling unheard. Even when they feel like they're being assertive, even when they feel like they're making a concerted effort and trying to stand up to Ethan for what they deserve. Obviously, last time it happened while they were filming the podcast. Not great form. Anyway, but they were feeling unheard. And then there was another point in there that I just wanted to point out, that Trisha reads comments oftentimes to kind of gauge what the audience is thinking. I will say this much about Trisha. They are good at accepting criticism. Anybody reading comments, especially if they're negative about them, I don't think it's good for one's mental health, but they do venture into the comments. And I've noticed that Trisha does take what people are saying, and if it is valid, they will oftentimes intuit that and learn from it. But one thing they pointed out is that a kind of common criticism was that people were calling Trisha manipulative for crying. And I don't have much to say about that except stop that. There's too much of a stigma about crying in our society. People repress so much so as not to go there. And that's actually a very healthy thing, in my opinion, is to allow yourself to cry and to allow others to do it. Of course, there's a time and place to really just like sob it the fuck out, right? But because somebody is upset and they are crying, it just doesn't make you manipulative to do that. So like, stop. We will talk about some other claims that people were making on both sides, but I hated that so much. Ethan said that he felt as though his hands were tied, that he had no choice but to really get on air and defend himself against the things that Trisha was claiming, even though he had a lot of really positive things to say about Trisha in the beginning, at least, of his video. But then I think he really started to go on to make a lot of like reasonable sounding points and arguments, and quite frankly, painted Trisha out to be this like entitled diva. And I don't want to say that in a way that discredits Ethan. Only they know what goes on, really, between them. And of course, there are people there who see what's going on. And then, of course, a lot of it is up to interpretation by one's own perspective and emotions. But that's just the only way I can put it. The way Ethan described the operations and Trisha's involvement made Trisha sound like a diva. It made Trisha sound super entitled, and made it sound like Trisha would ask for the sun, the moon, the earth, the stars. I think I used that saying in the last video. Well, it still applies. He made it sound like Trisha was asking for the sun, the moon, the stars, but without putting much effort in and without being much part of the process of producing this podcast, as well as letting us know that Trisha is making bank off of Frenemies, that Trisha makes so much money, and according to him, he probably makes no money on the podcast just because of how much money he puts into the business, or, you know, the business of Frenemies, not H3 as a whole. He did bring up an argument that they have had in the past about hiring employees. Ethan recently hired Ian's girlfriend, Sam, who had been working freelance for the production company, but then decided to bring her on as a salaried employee. Trisha felt as though she should have a say in who is hired because, again, Trisha felt, is what it sounded like from both perspectives. Trisha felt as though they should have a say in who is hired because, again, this is a partnership. This is something they're building together. They should have a say in who's hired for what. And I believe they expressed a want for a producer and a camera person. And I think just felt a little slighted that somebody was hired without being consulted at all. And Ethan made the point that Trisha does not have a say in who I hire for my company, H3 Productions. That doesn't belong to Trisha in any way, in any capacity. So who we hire is ultimately my decision. I agree with him there. I also told you guys I was going to give my opinion later, but whatever.
This is a super quick reminder to like this video and subscribe to my channel if that's something you want to do. If that's not something you want to do, just don't. I'll shut up and start talking now.
Again, he made the point about how Trisha's quit the podcast 3 times, and so that is a reason he has not felt comfortable kind of putting any of the decision making in Trisha's hands, and or why he hasn't gone along with some of their ideas. So again, sounds pretty reasonable. One thing he says, and Trisha also said, more or less, was that Ethan essentially said to his crew, hey, Trisha wants all of you guys fired. So are you down to shoot tomorrow? What? So, we'll talk about that for sure. Of course, the question about the crew, or the reason they were talking about the crew, is because Trisha made a point about how they wish that they had a say in the hiring process. And then the remark about that segment of the podcast being dumb, being lazy, that happened to be the idea of Sam, who had that was her first day of work as a salaried employee. So Ethan went on to defend his crew. We know that he's very protective of his crew, that he's got, from what we can tell and from what he tells us, great employees that work really hard. So he defended his crew a good bit, talked a good bit about production and logistics, things that Trisha maybe doesn't know anything about, how much they're working on Sundays to get prepped for the show, things that Trisha's not involved in. He also talked about money. He talked about how 5% of the money they make goes to the additional work that his crew puts in to make Frenemies happen. And he does make a point. 5%, that's nothing. No production company would do this work for such a small cut, which is most definitely true. But again, like, why are you talking about money? Why are you talking about money to your audience? He says that due to an ask by Trisha, he provides itemized reports about what money is spent on, but then later says that it just doesn't work like that he can't provide that. It doesn't work like that. So that was a little confusing, but he said that he provides reports to Trisha every month to, I guess, to show where money is being spent or allocated, I guess. And reiterates that really he doesn't think he's making any money off of Frenemies, or at least the merch that is supposed to be launched in about a month. And that's when we got 5 videos from Trisha in something like 24 hours, defending themselves against what they called Ethan's lies. I'm going to say from the onset that I see where Trisha's coming from and calling them lies, because the details from the way that Ethan portrayed them, I don't think is as accurate as they actually are. But I don't see most of these things as lies so much as Ethan making exaggerations and understatements and leaving out context that's really important. So they made something clear to us that the crew is not given, or, H3 Productions is not given just 5% of the podcast. They get 5% of the podcast or its profits. 5%, well, it wouldn't be profit because part of the crew's production costs. Okay, whatever. 5% of the money that Frenemies makes goes to the crew. But Trisha pointed out to us that 100% of the podcast highlights goes to the crew as well, and has pointed out that a lot of the highlights and a lot of the views that come from these highlights are hinged on, honestly, the clickability of Trisha's name and their behavior, really. So things like Trisha storms off and stuff like that, that garners a lot of views. And when it comes to these highlight clips, they're not seeing any of that money. So yeah, Ethan, you should have been a little more straightforward with that, because then this just weakens your argument when you don't tell the full context. And to give a bit of criticism to Trisha, they were saying that, they have to leave Frenemies, that to stay would hurt everybody more than it would if they just left. And I have to say that I disagree that that is your only option. I do think, and again, what the fuck do I know? But from an outsider's perspective, there are other options too. You can work this out. You could have worked this out in a different way. You still can work this out in a different way. Hurting or not hurting someone just with your presence in this situation, I don't think is really just kind of that binary, honestly. So they expressed again their want to be more involved in the decision-making process. This was a point that they really wanted to drive home, and with good reason. And in doing so, continued to point out what they perceived to be lies from Ethan, just kind of reaction style is what Trisha was doing, watching Ethan's video. And Trisha's reaction was spread out over the course of 3 or 4 videos that were 40 minutes each. So they had a lot to say. And it did get to the point where Trisha devolved into name calling with Ethan, which we've seen before. They called him things like a prick, an asshole, a liar, things like that. Whereas I did see this comparison online where they're like, this is how Ethan talks about Trisha and says like, oh, I respect Trisha as a friend, as a comedian, as a partner. And this is how Trisha speaks of Ethan. And Trisha says asshole, prick, all these things. But to be fair, although Ethan said those things, again, the picture he painted later didn't match, you know. However, we know what I think of name calling. Like, I'm never going to support that. And especially in these situations where you've come to love the relationship that these people have, and they have a very important relationship because it's not just a friendship, it's family. We'll get there too. There were a couple of things that they addressed, and I think this is important because Ethan pointed out some ways in which Trisha has been offensive, frankly, saying that Trisha tokenizes his Tourette's syndrome, and Trisha pointed out that they thought that Tourette's was on the table in terms of things that they could talk about casually, maybe even laugh about, just like they laugh about each other's weight and Trisha being a quote unquote crazy person and things like that, that if they had known that there was a boundary with the Tourette's, they never would have gone there, or they would have stopped rather. And I think the reason I pointed this out is because when Ethan and Trisha did have a session with Dr. Drew pointed out that with Trisha, there is a lack of perception of just normal social boundaries. Now, ultimately, it's on the person to own up to whatever behaviors are a result of that. However, if one wants to help a person grow, as Ethan wanted to do with Trisha as a friend and family, Ethan agreed and came to understand that with Trisha, you need to kind of spell out boundaries more clearly. And they both learned that they needed to do that with each other. If something was a no-go and we wanted to stop talking about it, they would express that to each other. Of course, like, some of the things that Trisha would say about Tourette's is like, to most of us, it's very obvious, like, don't say that. But I just wanted to point out that boundaries and having those expressed and making them very clearly delineated is really important in interacting with Trisha Paytas and having a healthy relationship. Whether or not you want to take that on is up to you. It's your decision. And when I say that, I only mean people who are involved in any sort of relationship with Trisha Paytas. But they kind of debunked some of the things that Ethan talked about, or, you know, provided more context that really changed everything about some of the things he was saying. So one of the things they talked about was the vlog where they did the Hollywood bus tour. And on Ethan's side of the story, he said, as an example, Trisha doesn't understand how much goes into putting together something like this. It takes a lot of work. And Trisha complained that the kind of cast on the bus was more or less just like friends and family of the crew. And Ethan went on to complain that, you know, Trisha just doesn't seem to understand that getting random strangers on a show like this requires a lot of consent forms, release forms. And so they needed to really kind of rely on people they knew that they already had the consent of. Something Trisha pointed out, however, was that it wasn't that Trisha wanted like strangers so much on that bus tour. The point they made was that they asked if they could bring some people they knew onto that episode, on the tour bus. I'm like, hey, I've got some people too. I can bring them on. And according to Trisha, Ethan said, nope, I've got it. We've got plenty of people. We're good. So that to me makes a really big difference. But they also said that they don't get an itemized report each month other than seeing kind of a list of what each episode of Frenemies makes, I'm pretty sure is what they were saying. They talked about having no idea where the highlights are spent. They don't know what sort of expenditures are involved in the production of this podcast, and that is paid for by that 5% or that 5% of the podcast plus 100% of the highlights. So that's important. And they express that they want to put in the effort, that they do provide things like the costumes whenever they do costumes. Trisha provides them, as well as like the glam teams and stuff like that, that they do want to be an investor in their own podcast, that they do want to assume risk along with Ethan, that they do promotion for the podcast, I think in their music videos, maybe, I think that's what they said, and has also offered and expressed a want to do these things. So they made it a point to make it very clear that they did not want to get rid of the crew. They like the crew a lot. And this will be like a common theme throughout the rest of the videos, is where Trisha is talking about how much they really do like the H3 crew. That's not the problem. They pointed out that they're not quote unquote an employer, so they don't understand all the ins and outs. So it kind of sounded to me like work with me a little bit. They pointed out that there was a time that Ethan said Moses is not allowed on set, and so Trisha respected that, and it was just Ethan, Trisha, and Dan on set, I think only for one episode. They talked about kind of their transgressions as well as Ethan's in the past. Basically, Ethan bringing up a lot of Trisha's outbursts from the past, things that Trisha said, particularly about Hila, but just in general, just some really terrible things that Trisha did and said in the past. And so Trisha addressed that, but also pointed out that Ethan has posted things online that they asked to keep private, so that it kind of goes both ways, but they have apologized for their past misbehaviors, essentially. And so it's like, why do you keep bringing this up? And to that point there, I will say that it is really frustrating when you apologize for something and then someone continues to bring it up. At the same time, I'm kind of on the fence with this, but at the same time, I do think that if you mess up and you apologize for that thing, whether or not that person accepts your apology, it doesn't end there. You have to show a pattern of behavior, a pattern of growth, and like give it time for those wounds to heal. You have to basically build a new reputation and allow that person to recover from whatever thing you put them through. So I get that it hurts, but I think that Ethan has every right to make decisions based on a number of things, but including some of those things that have happened in the past, but really not that long ago. That's just tough for everyone involved. So getting into more of my opinions about, everything that went down, kind of going back to the fight that really kind of started it all. I mean, that's not fair to say because obviously this problem was brewing, but the fight that brought this to the surface. Like I mentioned earlier in this video, Trisha came to the set in a bad mood, having a bad day. They said that from the onset. We knew that as the viewers. Ethan knew that, obviously. And like I said, they also talked about this whole issue with Gabby Hanna and that stupid article that was, yeah, you know. These things were upsetting. You could kind of tell that they were in a bad mood. And so what I didn't like was this exchange between Trisha and Ethan, where Ethan was talking about Trisha being upset. Trisha said something like, "I'm not upset. I'm really not." And then Ethan is like, "You are. You're upset." I don't know if that's exactly the word. I think at one point they said, "I'm not mad." And then Ethan was like, "But you're upset," or something like that.
You can be upset and not because you could be upset and then also not be like, "I'm not showing up. Fuck you."
I'm
like
not
there's
upset.
levels.
If I was upset, I wouldn't show up.
I'm just explaining. Because you can be upset and still show up.
But I'm not upset, and that's what gaslighting is. Because you're saying I'm gaslighting you by saying
you're not upset. You're perfectly.
Oh, wow.
You're in a perfect condition right now.
Okay. Wow. Holy cow, that's crazy.
And then finally, Ethan kind of like sarcastically relinquished the fight and was just like, "Okay, fine. Yeah, you're good. You're perfect." And that was messy. And it was just, I think, poor communication on both parts, because there is such thing as visible distress. No, nobody's allowed to tell you how you feel, but you have a responsibility to talk about how you feel. Or to say that you're feeling something and you don't want to talk about it. But it's not fair to be visibly in distress, some sort of distress. And when somebody asks you, like, what's wrong, or you seem upset, you seem frustrated, to be like, "No, I'm not, I'm fine. Because this argument had already started to erupt. So, I mean, unless I'm totally wrong and I'm the only person who saw this visible distress on Trisha, but I don't think so, because it's clearly Ethan saw it too. If you're not mad, but you're just frustrated, then say that. Like, find words to communicate your feelings properly. And I think that's what happened, is that it became this argument over semantics. And then Trisha's takeaway, as well as some of their supporters that they showed in some of these videos, a lot of the Trisha side of this argument says that Ethan was gaslighting Trisha by saying, oh, okay, yeah, you're totally perfectly fine. And I just want to say to that, stop. I feel like people need to earn a license to use the word gaslight at this point. I'm so tired of it. I'm sorry to be so harsh, but that was, in my opinion, a normal argument. Didn't say it was perfectly healthy, didn't say it was how I would want it to go down, but that was an argument between two people, and that was Ethan making a snarky, sarcastic response to this frustration that it seemed he had over the frustration that Trisha seemed to have that Trisha wasn't owning up to. And so to say that Ethan was gaslighting Trisha for saying, yeah, you are upset, or like, you seem that way. Okay, you're perfectly fine. Honestly, I find it to be more emotionally abusive or manipulative or whatever you want to call it to deny the perception that you're giving off, this distress that is visible. To deny that, I think, is more of a gaslight, because it is crazy making. When somebody, we've all been there, when we're dealing with somebody who's clearly upset or distressed or something, and when we ask about it, they say, I'm fine. That's crazy making. And if something is crazy making, that's more or less what gaslighting is. So I just wish people would just stop using that word, because you can argue that it's being used, and it was an argument. It was an argument. They had an argument is what happened. And as far as kind of the argument they were having about the business and how it's run, and when I say the business, I mean Frenemies, but I also mean H3, because there seems to be this like disconnect as to whether Frenemies is its own thing, its own entity, or if it falls under the H3 umbrella. But I think, obviously, I'm no sort of expert when it comes to this sort of thing, so they probably could benefit from working with a mediator of sorts. Because if you think about it, Ethan and Trisha have a show together, this podcast. They have a friendship with one another that has seemed to be very beneficial for both of them, but particularly for Trisha. And they are family now at this point. So all of those things combined is just one hell of a conflict of interest, really. And I have tried starting businesses with friends, and it really does. Decision-making stuff really can fuck with your relationships. So I think they really could benefit from having a third party help them work some of this stuff out. But I do think that when they first had this idea of creating this podcast, it made a lot of sense for Frenemies to live under the H3 Productions umbrella. The fact that it was on the H3 podcast channel, I don't think that ever really truly made sense to me, but it being produced by H3 Productions made sense. They had no idea how big it would get. And so H3 took on all of this risk, and they knew how to produce a podcast. But then, of course, Frenemies got really big. People loved it. I might have already said this, but we loved it because we came to see this friendship really start to blossom, and for it to be something super healing for somebody that we started to root for as we saw some like emotional and mental personal growth. And maybe it's unfair to put all of that on Ethan, but it's just, that's a reason that a lot of us came to really love this show. And how they decided to run the show made sense in the beginning. It's some kind of this thing that they were trying out. But once it became as big as it became, and considering the two creators, the talent, and kind of their status, if I'm being totally honest, the production value of Frenemies is just not there. It's not where it should be, considering who we're watching. So we're clearly not watching it because it's a super well-produced podcast. It's not. We're watching because we love them. And that's great. You want your business to be successful because of the people that were the content creators. But that makes sense that once we saw that this was steadily successful, they really should have gone back to the drawing board and made these decisions all over again, where they're going to work, who's going to make decisions on what. And to Trisha's point that, they did bring a large audience and honestly maintained that audience. I really don't think that Ethan would have, if he brought on another host, it would not perform. Not like Trisha Paytas' views. If you want to know about Trisha Paytas' views, take a look at Gabby Hanna's podcast, the number of views on any episode compared to the Trisha Paytas episode. So it does make sense. When you bring this much value to the table, it makes sense to say, okay, well, I want to be part of the decision-making process. And they should have had room for that, because they should have, like I said, gone back to the drawing board, or at least gone back to make some tweaks to up the value of the podcast and to make sure that everybody was happy with their role there. I think these two people really need to open their eyes and be really honest with themselves about where their strengths lie and where their shortcomings lie. And I could be wrong about these people. I don't know them personally, but it seems to me that Trisha needs to really kind of get a grip on understanding what they don't understand, that everything that goes into producing a podcast. You really need to have an idea of what goes into this before you ask to be a primary decision maker. And I think that there's room to learn about those things. So I think first is recognizing what you don't know, and then of course moving on to learn those things. And for Ethan, listen, Ethan is a really good business person. Like, that much is obvious. But kind of through hearing different sides of this story, it's apparent that he is very hardworking and very dedicated to, these passion projects. Well, can't really call it a passion project if it's actually successful, but it seemed to start as a passion project. But he cares about these passion projects. That's why it's called the passion project. So he's very dedicated to these things, and he does a lot, and he's very good at what he does. But he also seems to be a bit of a control freak, honestly. And so if you're going to refer to Trisha as my partner in this podcast, at this point, again, because of the number of views that Trisha brings in, you kind of have to be willing to look at them as a partner. Then you have to be willing to give up some control in the situation. And I think that is Ethan's critical flaw in all of this. I could be wrong, but I feel like a lot of us have been in a situation, whether we're on one side or the other, or we just know about a situation where there's one person who is very capable in a certain area and they're working with somebody else and they just decide to go ahead and do more of the work. And then there's the other person two, who says like, oh, I can do these things. And person one is just like, no, I got this. I got it. I can do this in my sleep. Let me take care of it. And then what you end up with is two people that resent each other because you have person one doing more of the work and there being an imbalance there in terms of the output that each person did. But then you have person two who feels slighted because they didn't have any control over the outcome. They didn't have any sort of say in how things were done, and they offered. And that's kind of what this situation looks like to me. And after hearing both sides of the story, it really is apparent to me that Ethan has grown comfortable, it seems. I say apparent, that means I don't know for sure. Speculation. Ethan seems to be really comfortable with having his people around. And I think that is a really big issue and something that perhaps needed to be corrected for Frenemies to continue, in that Trisha needs to be happy. They both need to be happy. And thus far, it's been the H3 crew. They're lovely people. I like everybody on that team. They add a lot of value to the show. But they are Ethan's people. They're his employees. They're the people he works with on a day-to-day basis. He has a history with these people, and he hand-selected these people. But it goes a little further when we go back to the situation where like Moses was banned from the set, or the bus situation where Ethan brought, the crew and their family and friends. And then, of course, they're recording the podcast under the H3 umbrella in the Klein's home. I mean, everything has been done on Ethan's home turf, I think is one of the issues here. It's also apparent to me that Trisha just wants to have some of their people involved, or just have a say in hiring somebody so that they don't feel like just an add-on to the H3 crew. That makes sense to me. It does. But yeah, if you're going to continually bring your people in and say, no, I don't want you to bring people on the bus or, have your people around, then you really can't complain that person 2 didn't do their part. If you're going to be the one who needs to be in control, if you're person 1 and you need control, you really can't complain about the fact that you're doing more. We've all been there. We've all been on one side or the other, or both. And I think the same goes for any investments, any expenditures, any liability, these things that Ethan talked about. Again, if you are not giving the other person the opportunity to assume some of those things, then you can't complain that they didn't do them, especially if that person has offered. So this seems like a conversation it's just a conversation that needs to be had and maybe a little bit of work done on both sides. And something that I do want to point out that kind of stuck out to me, because we know these numbers, we know that there's a 50% to 45% split, that 50% of the money that the podcast makes goes to Ethan, and that 45% goes to Trisha, and that 5% goes to the crew. And Ethan harps on this and the fact that it costs more than that to produce the podcast. I mean, not that I know the numbers, but no shit, it kind of says 5% doesn't sound like anything. But again, I forgot the highlights detail, but also that's not even Steven. You can't really complain and be like, you get a 45% cut and then I assume all the costs of everything else. What I'm trying to say is that if they were keeping this even between the two of them, then Trisha should have 45, Ethan should have 45, and production should get 10. And so I don't understand where this why is the 5% only coming out of Trisha's half? Of course, those are terms that they negotiated and agreed upon, but it's just, if 5% is not enough money, then ask yourself, is 10% enough? And if not, then go back to the drawing board. Come on, everybody. And if it's not enough money, then give Trisha the opportunity to invest just like you are, Ethan. Give them the opportunity. It all comes down to how do you see Trisha, as a partner or as a contractor? Because Ethan makes it sound like Trisha is so demanding with these itemized reports that Trisha says they don't even get. Again, I get just the numbers of how much money each episode makes. But if you're talking about a partnership, I would want to know, especially if we're talking about the 5% that only comes out of my half. I'd like to know how that's being spent and allocated. And the way Ethan said, that's just not how things run. Yes, it is. Actually, that's really not that difficult to do. Come on, tell me that they don't have a CPA that has these things written down for when they file their taxes. You have lists of the equipment that you put in, the labor, the hours per person, their salary, etc. You have access to this information to talk about how much money it costs to run Frenemies. That is quantifiable. And if it's quantifiable, then you should be able to provide a report to the other person who feels like they are, 50-50 partner in this. But of course, this whole argument is about the fact that Trisha really isn't a 50-50 partner. And then also the argument that they don't necessarily deserve to be a 50-50 partner. I see both of those sides. Just want to make that clear. So that all of that was very harsh on Ethan, but I think when it comes down to it, Ethan really needs to be honest with himself about how much control he feels he needs over these things. And if he wants those Trisha Paytas numbers, and really more importantly, if he wants to foster this relationship that they've worked so much to build, honestly, then you gotta give. There's gotta be some compromise here. So that's really more or less what I think is kind of did I say Ethan's critical flaw? Yeah, I think that was what I called it. I don't think he's a bad guy. I'm not team Trisha, oh my God, Ethan is an asshole and a prick and a liar and all that stuff. It's really just Ethan, oh my goodness. Everything turned off for a second. So let me see if I can gather where I was in talking about this. I think I was just saying that I don't think that Ethan is this massive asshole for his behavior in this situation. But I think he just needs to learn how to give a little bit. As for Trisha, I already said this. I think they need to take the time to really understand what goes into producing a podcast before really wanting to jump in and be 50-50, decision makers. But really, more importantly, you need to bring up these issues at the right time in the right place. And I think that much is obvious to everybody. But I think the huge takeaway, or the thing that I kept thinking while watching this, is don't make decisions while highly emotional. It just doesn't work. I've talked a good bit about therapy, about psychologists that I watch on YouTube, what I know of the limbic system. But what I do know is, again, here's your armchair psychology. What I do know is that we are shit decision makers when we are flooded, more or less, with emotion. And it was very apparent that Trisha was highly emotional during the podcast episode and in all of these follow-up videos. And it's okay to be emotional. That's going to happen for everyone. But I think another question too, and this is kind of a difficult one to ask, I'm curious as to whether or not Trisha's going through it emotionally, mentally right now. They're very honest about having kind of a bevy of diagnoses and symptoms and things that they have to manage. And from time to time, we regress a little bit especially when we're kind of just starting to grow and really start to get a handle on these things. I think Trisha's done an amazing job over the past year, kind of getting a handle on these things. But I also think that they have kind of been holding themselves to the standard of perfection. And I think people have placed them on a pedestal for that. So when you do have a moment where you kind of regress to how you used to be, even if it's not as extreme, I think it just seems a lot more shocking to everybody involved when we see somebody really so well behaved and then we see them misbehave. I think that everybody involved needs to recognize that we're dealing with people here, and that particularly when it comes to Trisha, there is some mental health stuff there. And let me be clear, I am not saying Trisha has some mental health stuff, so they are not responsible for this situation, or that Trisha said some really awful things that they need to apologize for, in my opinion. The name calling especially. Saying that this idea is dumb, that is really unprofessional. Yes, you have every right to give an opinion about ideas when this is your business, or even if you're just an employee, you do have the right to give that feedback. But again, time and place. So I am not giving Trisha a pass for having mental health struggles. What I'm saying is, can we not throw the baby out with the bathwater? Am I using that saying correctly? Let's pretend that I am. Let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater because perhaps there is a resurgence of certain symptoms for Trisha right now, if that's what's going on. I don't know. But I kind of joked when I saw that 1-minute video about Gabby Hanna that I was like, oh shit, looks like the old Trisha's back.
Also, this message is for Gabby Hanna. Gabby Hanna, you still suck. You are a scary ass bitch and you are a rape apologist. Those phone calls prove that you are an actual rape apologist, which you denied, and you are the lowest, most disgusting form of human being ever. And don't think for a second that last Frenemies episode on views had anything to do with you. In fact, I'd rather them change the title. I asked them not to change the title to Storms Out. Please change the title to Storms Out, because that's why people are watching that and not you, Gabby. No one gives a fuck. I'm so sick that I even talked about you, that I have allowed you to just absolutely eat away at me, but now also Jesse and all these other people that you've been an absolutely disgusting, vile person to. You are disgusting. You are a liar and a psychopath, and you need serious help. So don't even think for a second that you're trolling or winning or anyone thinks you're relevant. It's not translating to views for you. You suck. You suck. You suck. You suck.
That's what I'm starting to hear people say about this situation, is that it looks like the old Trisha is back. And so I do think that it is a substantial theory or a question to say hey, do you need maybe some more support at this time? Yeah, I just want to express it's okay. It's okay. We hear it often. It's okay to not be okay, but just be honest with yourself. You don't need to say anything to us, but be honest with yourself before you go making permanent decisions based on temporary emotions. One of my viewers reminded me of that saying in the most recent podcast. So that came off the tip top of my head, but only because of that person. So thank you. Don't make permanent decisions based on temporary emotions. I think that is what these people are doing, and particularly Trisha Paytas. And Ethan needs this too, to an extent, but learn how to better communicate your feelings, because something was going on, right? And I think instead of saying Ethan's gaslighting me and manipulating me or whatever, emotionally abusing me, it's not up to me to tell you how things feel or seem. And now I sound like I'm speaking directly to Trisha Paytas. I do this in a lot of videos, but it's not my place to tell you how to take these things, how to feel. But just as an outsider looking in, somebody who really likes both of these people, I would think it more appropriate to say that Ethan was being mean in the way that he responded to Trisha. That, you know, being sarcastic like that is mean. It's not, you don't have to take it so far as to call it a gaslight and abuse. It's just, but it is mean. And you can say that. And you have every right to say that. And you should say that. And also, you know what else is mean is kind of this narrative that Ethan has spun that Trisha wants to fire the whole crew, get rid of all of them. Oh, and are you guys good to shoot tomorrow? No, nobody's going to want to shoot with Trisha Paytas if Trisha said that they wanted to get rid of those people and fire them and render them unemployed. And I think that that was a move. Like, I don't use words like this often. So when I say it, I mean it. I do think it was manipulative on the part of Ethan. If that was not said, if Trisha did not say, I want to fire the crew, if Trisha really just said, I just want to, you know, have some say in who we hire. I'd like to bring in a producer. I see that the employees are so overworked. We should also bring in a camera person. That is not saying you want to fire the crew at all. That's not at all what that sounds like. And I've even seen people defending Ethan saying like, yeah, Trisha, that is essentially what you're saying when you're saying, no, that's not what Trisha said. I think what's happening in that situation is that Ethan is triangulating his crew, meaning that he has figured out a way to drive a wedge between Trisha and his crew, which is not that hard for him to do because it's his crew, which kind of just goes back to illustrate again the imbalance we have here in terms of, you know, turf. These are all Ethan's people. They have more of an allegiance to him. So understandably, Trisha just wants some people for them too. You know, and of course, like the crew is great to Trisha from what I've seen. But at the end of the day, you know, they're there with Ethan and Ethan can say things like, oh, Trisha wants y'all fired. So you down to shoot? Like, oh my gosh, I hate that. Oh, I hate that so much. So I really hope that both of these people really just take time to calm down. Really just like give it a break. We're okay with you guys taking a break, however long it needs to be. I really hope to see them come back to Frenemies. I really love that podcast. A lot of the people I interact with online really love that podcast. A lot of people really love that podcast. And there's almost this recurring thing of bringing Dr. Drew on to help them work out their problems. Do it again. Keep that as a running segment anytime you guys have problems. Honestly, like, you know, people have their opinions about Dr. Drew, but to show that they go into counseling together when there is a problem is such a healthy example to display for their audience. So I hope that they consider maybe that again. But if not for the podcast, for their friendship, again, like I said, this important friendship, this amazing friendship that we all have loved to watch blossom. But if not for the podcast, if not for the friendship, at least for their family, because, you know, Ethan's family is only growing at this point, and Trisha, like I said, is really becoming an integrated part of this family. And I would hate for there to be some sort of rift kind of at the Moses and Elah point. That's not fair. It's really not fair for anyone to do that to siblings, to themselves, or to a family. I think you guys owe it to yourselves. Now I'm talking to them again. I think you guys owe it to yourselves to work this out. I think that you both have a lot of love for each other. I think you both have a lot of respect for each other. I think this is a situation in which both people can do something to better it. So here's where I do my thing again and say, I talked for a long time. I did. I do that. I tend to do that. To the one person who's still watching, who's not me, thank you. Thank you for hanging tight this long and listening to me ramble about frenemies and about everything here lately. There's a lot going on. And so I have a lot to say, and it's exhausting for everybody involved. But yeah, to you, the one person who's watching, who's not me, I love you, dude. Thank you. I hope you've liked the video at this point, maybe. If not, you can give it a like. Thank you to Surfshark VPN for sponsoring this video. Thank you so much. If I can just ask anything of you is, it's like I usually say on my podcast, tell somebody you love them today, or just check on someone. And I have high hopes that Ethan and Trisha will work this out. Or I'll have to be like a child of divorce, which I am, and just have to love them separately, which I can do that too. So that said, I'm gonna go do something else. And I love you guys, and I'll see you on the next Basically a Podcast. You'll see me there and in the next video. Okay, thanks. Bye.